believe that incest between consenting adults should be legal. I don't really think it's a moral issue whatsoever, and I don't think it should receive any moral condemnation or social disapprobation whatsoever. However, in this debate, we'll be focusing on legality rather than the inherent morality or social stigma of incest. However, most of the arguments I'm going to be presenting here would apply just as easily to either of those questions. So, okay, why do I think incest should be legal? Firstly, I would appeal to the following basic principle. For any X should be legal unless good reasons can be given for outlawing it. I claim then that my position has a natural advantage. The burden of proof is not on me to show why incest should be legal. The burden of proof is on my opponent to show why it should be outlawed. Secondly, I would make a liberal argument from consent. The liberal position on consent, as succinctly as possible, is just that consent is a necessary and sufficient condition for a sexual act being considered moral and legal. The liberal position on consent can be justified by appeal to a few different arguments. Firstly, once we start saying that certain kinds of sex are wrong and should be illegal even between consenting adults, we open the door to authoritarianism, paternalism, and state intervention into our private lives. We generally value privacy, and we don't want the government getting involved with what we do in our private bedrooms, and the liberal view prevents that. Secondly, we could make an argument from autonomy. So the basic idea is I have ownership over my own body. I get to decide what happens to my own body, and outlawing me from being able to do what I want with my body is prima facie bad. Any other position, I would claim, kind of infantilizes people. So the opposition to what I'm saying would have to be that, you'd have to say that a consenting adult can't choose to have sex with another consenting adult, right? But if everyone involved consents, right, why is it your business who people have sex with? Thirdly, there's a utilitarian argument. If all parties are consenting to the interaction, it's likely that the sex is a net positive for all parties. If it wasn't, the parties likely wouldn't consent to it. Of course, there are exceptions. Sometimes people consent to things that are bad for them. But in general, I know better than you do what's good for me. So if two people want to engage in a sex act, it's reasonable to presume that it's a positive for the parties for the act to occur. And thirdly, another argument I would make is just that these laws cause a lot of harm, right? Imprisonment is a serious harm. It seriously depletes the quality of one's life, right? It's not fun. It makes your life drastically worse than it otherwise would have been to be locked up in prison for like multiple years. And as a side point, I would just say, even if you think incest is immoral and should be discouraged, that doesn't mean we should criminalize it or make it illegal, which is an extremely cruel response, right? There are other ways of preventing certain activities that don't involve locking people in cages. And then finally, I would just appeal to this sort of vague intuition that, in general, we should just respect people's choices, right? We should treat people how we would want to be treated. Everyone on the planet has some tastes or some sexual tastes that would be considered deviant or gross by one group or another. So we should just try to be more accepting and respect people's choices and preferences. We shouldn't demonize or criminalize people for what they choose to get up to in their own bedrooms. So that's pretty much it. That's my basic opening case.
All right. And I'll try to be quick here, and thank you for that, because you're very clear.
Thank you.
So yeah, I think mouthy infidel today is kind of facing an uphill climb. Incest is something that's nearly universally a taboo, save for seldom cases throughout human history where it was encouraged, certain select states or governments, perhaps. However, the proposition of my opponent is correct. Regardless of the taboo, and regardless of the evidence of harms, the harms of inbreeding, regardless of the harms of incest, propensity for abuse, regardless of our collective disgust, somehow incest should be made legal. And because of that, I want to talk about the boring legal side of things for a minute. And why do we make behaviors legal? This is the burden that my opponent must address. And I don't think shifting the burden of proof here is appropriate. So let's ask ourselves, what is the purpose of the law? And we should be clear, the law does several things to preserve social order. That's its purpose. It does this by promoting and restricting certain behaviors. And how do we know what should be a law in our representative systems? We look at the needs and the values of our communities. If we were to not do this for our laws, then our laws would not represent the values, will, and desires of our people. We cannot call ourselves a self-governing system in any sense. We could not say we, the people, are forming this more perfect union. We are not the government. We are instead ideologically possessed by this liberalism to the extent where our values are actually forgotten. And thus, to claim incest should be legal is to claim the values of our community must be ignored in government. Left or right of center, this isn't really a good start. Now, my opponent's spoken of autonomy and liberty. And even if we don't value particular kinds of autonomy or liberty, the law does enshrine some liberty. On that, I'm sure we agree. So the argument then is that this freedom in particular is what ought be enshrined in our law. This is what we should change our law to reflect. And that is a statement of normative ethics, right? Because we value freedom, liberty, autonomy, somehow we must value this particular kind. And this doesn't seem to cash out. For example, I have the freedom to forsake my responsibilities as a husband and father and run away across the country. You have the autonomy to murder someone in cold blood if you so choose. We have the liberty to vote in a fascist for president. But that doesn't mean any of those things are right to do, right? Just wanting freedom, wanting liberty or autonomy does not at all imply an ethical basis to do any particular thing, or even that those things are permissible. And in order to win this debate, my opponent's arguments cannot reference such principles and their continuation as a sufficient basis to warrant such a change in the law. Now, my opponents talked a bit about the utilitarian side of things. The harms of incest, perhaps the pleasure gained outweighs the harms in some kind of utilitarian calculus. This is more appealing, perhaps, because we could avoid some obvious deontic failures, right? We obviously wouldn't will that we all sleep with our siblings or parents. I don't think Kant would agree with that, but hey, who knows? But let us address this as a proper utilitarian would and should. First and foremost, the harms of incest and inbreeding are nearly unanimously agreed upon by geneticists, psychologists, and sociologists. Further, we see that it is highly probable that incest is an indicator of abuse. In fact, some people arguing that incest is categorically abuse in all situations. We'll be talking more about that utilitarian calculus as well when we get into children with genetic defects that seriously affect their opportunities, survival, and fitness. And those changes over generation. We see that the longer that a trend of incest goes on, in particular with inbreeding, the higher the risk until finally the gene pool is diverse enough over several generations later to accommodate non-incestuous relations once more. And further, we do see an overwhelming precursor in incest cases, including both homosexual and heterosexual cases, as a severe psychological stressor. In other words, incest is brought on by typically some precursor of death, divorce, or illness of a loved one. And not to mention the fact that psychologists virtually unanimously agree that incest by itself is sexual abuse. But I'm going to conclude with this, right? My opponent must make an argument from normative ethics about a change in behavior, a change in law in our society. My opponent has to claim that now is the time to legalize incest. My opponent has to claim that this represents our shared values despite the near universal tattoo, or that those shared values ought be ignored completely in our democracy. My opponent must claim that incest is less harmful than the restriction of its practice. And finally, my opponent must demonstrate a clear and compelling reason for the legalization of incest beyond arguments from autonomy, liberty, or freedom. And I guess I said finally twice here. Finally, my opponent must prove that incestuous relationships are not categorically abuse. And that's where I'll leave that. So if we want to get into it, I'm definitely excited to explore this argument more.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple ways we could go about this. So obviously, there's a ton of points on the table there that I have a lot to say about all of them. So do you just want to start with like one specific point, and I can give you my rebuttals, and then we can talk about it, and then maybe move on to other points later, or do you want me to just sort of like give a broad outline of all the things I caught that I disagreed with?
I was gonna say we can kind of break it up
Okay.
however we want. I think one of the things that I'd like to discuss first, because it is probably one of the bigger points of contention, is that there is such a thing as consensual incest. Um, and my understanding is, from what I've been reading, and I have several psychologists I could cite directly if you'd like, but my understanding is that there's not really such a thing as consensual incest because we're looking at a particular set of power dynamics entering these relationships. And those power dynamics are absolutely a factor in what we'd consider consent. And I don't know how you divorce the family from those particular power dynamics.
Okay, so I guess I would say like three different things about that point specifically. So I would just say like firstly, um, many incestuous relationships I just don't think have this kind of power imbalance. So for example, if we look at like siblings of similar ages, etc., or cousins of similar ages, there's not going to be, I mean, where's the problematic power imbalance there? And then even between like parents and children or siblings with larger age gaps, I mean, once you're an adult, you're an adult, right? The relationship you have with older family members when you're an adult is nothing like the relationship you have with them when you're a child, right? I sort of reject the idea that the power imbalance that existed when you were a kid sort of transfers over somehow. And if it happened that the relationship began when the younger person was a child, then there is a problematic power imbalance. But that's just a different issue, because in this debate, I'm only defending incest between consenting adults. And then just two other points. Secondly, I would say, look, there are significant power imbalances in many non incestuous relationships, right? There are significant power imbalances in a relationship between a poor person and a rich person, or a smart person and a dumb person, or a strong person and a weak person, or maybe someone and their boss or something. But nobody thinks that the state should be able to step in and outlaw these relationships. In fact, people would consider it to be like a serious authoritarian infraction if the state tried to intervene and ban these kinds of relationships. And thirdly, if the concern is preventing abuse, a law against incest is just redundant, right? We already have laws covering domestic abuse, rape, grooming, sexual assault, etc. In fact, if anything, a law against incest might be harmful, right? By outlawing all incestuous relationships, you force them all out of sight and underground, which only makes it more difficult for people to pinpoint the genuinely abusive ones. And additionally, if someone finds themselves in an abusive, incestuous relationship, they're not going to be able, in our current society, to come out and tell anyone about it and get help because they're too afraid of the stigma or the legal penalty associated with the fact that they participated in an incestuous relationship. If it were legal, people would be more free to, would have more of a capacity to get out of abusive, incestuous relationships if they found themselves in one. Um, so, yeah,
Yeah,
that's all my claims.
I think that your first kind of supporting argument kind of negates your second one, or the second one negates the first. But I think you do have to kind of commit to one, because either there's you can deny that there's a power imbalance, right, or you can say that the power imbalance exists, right. And that seems pretty clear to me. But I wanted to return to this notion on, say, similar ages, right? Even with cousins across similar ages, and I can speak to one. I have a cousin who is maybe 3 4 years younger than me, right? I'm 30 now. Um, and my cousin, went and joined the military after I went and joined the military, right? And I've always been like like an older brother figure, right? And there's a question, if I was to get involved in particular ways with him, right? Where my question would be, if it wasn't for this age difference, right, that has him looking up to me, right, just because I'm older and I look cooler to him, and those things, and I've done some things and I have these certain institutional backings behind me. If it wasn't for that, would he be kind of copying me and doing what I'm doing, right? And it seems like the answer is no, right? It seems like if it were not for that power being there, then he might not have joined, the military, might not have gone off to go do these other things, right? And that seems like a realistic plausibility, right? And if it was the same thing with, any other sexual relationship, like a teacher and a student, like, hey, would that student be having sex with that teacher if they weren't their teacher? Like that's a question that I think needs to be asked when we're evaluating these things. So I do understand the concern with the state interfering with autonomy, and I do think that that's a serious concern. I think one way to look at that as well is that we do interfere in autonomous relationships all the time, right? And we do have. Particularly when we're talking about surviving legal scrutiny and constitutional scrutiny, we do find reason to intervene in these private relationships all the time, right? Like we don't remove the restrictions on child abuse. Say if someone was beating their child, we don't say, well, we're going to decriminalize beating your child so that way that can kind of come out in the light and we can address it as a society. And I think most of us would find that to be the wrong thing to do. So I don't necessarily hold that the state doesn't have a place in intervening in these relationships in all contexts at all times.
Okay, so there's a few points I would make. The first is just, you said that I can either deny that there's a power imbalance or say that it exists. And my second point and my first point are in conflict with one another. But I don't think they are. I mean, I think the point is just like, look, it seems like you have this argument against legalizing incest. And like premise one of that argument is that like incestuous relationships often like have problematic power imbalances. And the second premise is that if they have these problematic power imbalances, we should outlaw them. And my first point was attacking the first premise, and my second point was attacking the second premise. But the fact that I said, okay, well, even if I grant the first premise, I still don't believe in the second premise for alternative reasons, that's not equivalent to saying that I actually believe that the first premise is true. And in addition to that, you gave this, you talked about how, and you said this earlier, that like, look, we do interfere in autonomous relationships all the time, right? But I didn't say that we never should. I didn't say like as a categorical statement, we should never interfere with consensual relationships, or we should never violate people's autonomy to any degree by having the state involve itself in their private affairs. My point was that violating autonomy is just prima facie wrong, or prima facie something that we should avoid. And there can be overriding reasons such that it becomes okay to violate people's autonomy. But I'm just saying that like the fact that we're violating people's autonomy just counts against doing so, not that it's like a decisive consideration in every case. And so I would just need to be provided with strong overriding reasons for why we should, violate people's autonomy by stopping them from engaging, stopping adults from engaging in consensual sexual activities. And then you also brought up, look, we have restrictions on child abuse, and you kind of used that to target my premise about how maybe legalizing incest would allow us to better pinpoint cases of abuse, or or allow people who find themselves in abusive incestuous relationships to come out and be honest about it, and get the help that they need and report it to the police. And you compared that to, well, we have restrictions on child abuse, but I don't think that's analogous, because we have restrictions on child abuse because doing so prevents abuse, right? There would be no point in, like, if my rationale for legalizing incest is that if someone finds themselves in an abusive incestuous relationship, I want them to be able to come out and tell the police. And so long as incest is legal or is illegal, it's harder for them to do that, because if they go to the police, they've also committed a crime. But that same logic doesn't really apply to child abuse, because we don't criminalize people for being abused. We don't criminalize children being abused and penalize them and stigmatize them for that necessarily. And then finally, you talked about this this notion of you told like an anecdote about you and your cousin, and about how your cousin maybe like looks up to you. and thinks you're, very cool and so on. But I mean, if we're going to be in the business of saying that the state should criminalize relationships in virtue of the fact that, one person looks up to the other person or something like that, I mean, I don't know. I think that's just an absurd standard. I don't think we would accept that in any other case.
Yeah, and I'll respond, and then if you wanted to give your last words here, just so we can move on, and you can pick the next kind of point to address. Um, I think I don't think it's an absurd standard because I think we currently recognize it. We recognize it in our institutions, like a high school teacher having sex with an 18-year-old student is something that we tend to take issue with. We tend to dig into their careers and things like that. Possibly in their careers, the person may never teach again. And we find reason to do that in part because of another kind of phenomenon that occurs here, right? Which is the grooming, and part of incest is the emotional incest, right? A lot of the waning on and kind of priming, and when we legalize something, we have to be clear about what happens with that, right? And that's going to be there are going to be the opportunists sitting there camping and pushing the boundaries and doing what they're going to get away with. So you have an adult that maybe groomed this child all the way through, a father grooming a daughter perhaps, and then at the end of this time, where this daughter's been groomed at 18, and then the dad says, "Oh yeah, I waited until after 18 to have sex." See, but their entire life they had this kind of like trauma afflicted, and then when we talk about the getting them out of that, if that person does realize it's abuse and they seek help, we're talking about years of therapy. For survivors of incest, the average amount of therapy spent, according to one doctor that was interviewed on CNN, said he spends around 7 years or so with these people in therapy, because it takes that long to deprogram them that they are not a slave for someone else, that they don't owe this to someone else, that they aren't lesser, and that this person isn't kind of a master or knows better for them. And it can be incredibly traumatizing, right? And realistically, these are the types of scenarios that we're going to be just openly inviting in with decriminalization, or more specifically with legalization. So that seems to be the concern there.
Yeah, so I would just say that with respect to, so I caught like 2 points. With respect to the first point that, we recognize that like a high school teacher can't have sex with an 18-year-old student. So that's true, but I don't think that's really, so like the example you gave is just one about, like, look, if we're talking about adults in an incestuous relationship, and maybe like your cousin, as you described it, or anyone's cousin who's like somewhat younger than them, looks up to them and thinks they're very cool and so on, and dates them for that reason. I don't think that the dynamic there is as extreme as the dynamic between a teacher and a student. And the reason for that is because in the case of like a teacher-student relationship, it's built into that relationship. Like it's a necessary component of the dynamic between a teacher and a student, that the teacher like has the power to like determine that student's life prospects by giving them a failing grade or giving them a passing grade, etc. And so built into the dynamic between a teacher and the student is this element that the teacher has the ability to use like sexual favors as a quid pro quo type arrangement to by via threat of penalizing or giving unfair positive treatment to that student. But I don't think there's any analogous dynamic like that that's necessarily built in to a consensual incestual relationship between two adults. And it's also worth mentioning that in large part, in some respects, like, yeah, it's illegal for a teacher to date a student. In some respects, I imagine that has something to do with the fact that teachers work directly for the state, like it's a state institution. But we don't see the government intervening in private institutions or in purely private affairs. Like, we don't see the state outlawing a boss dating a coworker, or a boss dating one of the workers at the business necessarily. That's generally not outlawed. And I guess with respect to the point about grooming, I agree that grooming is bad and grooming should be prevented. But I would just say, like, look, we already have laws against grooming, and I'm in favor of having those laws against grooming. And so a law against incest is just to prevent grooming is just redundant when we can just have a law to prevent grooming. And again, I would say, if anything, a law against incest hurts our ability to deal with grooming because it hurts our ability to, by forcing all incestual relationships underground, it hurts our ability to pinpoint the instances of incestual relationships where we can reason that it seems as though grooming or emotional manipulation has taken place, and it decreases the likelihood of the victim of grooming coming out and explaining their situation to other people. So I guess that's all I'd say about the abuse point, but I don't know if you wanted to go on to something else now or
Yeah. Why don't you drive? I picked the first point. I think you should pick the second.
Yeah, so I guess we can go to the genetic disorders thing. So I would just say that, because you brought up this point a few times about how legalizing incest would increase like genetic disorders, and I would just say, like, firstly, incest doesn't necessarily produce children. So even if we accept the appeal to genetic defects, at most we can conclude that inbreeding should be criminalized, not necessarily that incest should be criminalized. And secondly, there are many other people who have inheritable diseases or who are carriers of dangerous recessive genes, who we don't really legally prevent from breeding. Right? We don't prevent people with serious disabilities from breeding with one another. And in fact, most of us would consider it a serious authoritarian infraction to prevent these people from breeding with each other. We would consider it like a form of eugenics if we tried to do that. And then finally, thirdly, I would just say, like, the argument assumes basically that a child being born with a genetic defect harms someone, and therefore we can use the law to prevent that harm. But I would just say, who exactly does it harm, right? Maybe you could say that the child is harmed. The child has a lower quality of life due to genetic defects than it would have if it were born to different parents. But I think that this falls prey to the non-identity problem, as pointed out by Derek Parfit, right? If we have a boy named Johnny who is born of inbreeding and has genetic defects, we can ask the question, could Johnny's parents have done any better for him? The answer is no, right? If Johnny's mother had sex with a different person, she would have just had a different child. Johnny wouldn't have existed. For Johnny, there was no alternative to existing with these genetic defects besides just not existing at all. And then I guess maybe you could say that inbreeding harms society. More disabled people being born puts a strain on society and so on. But it's very unlikely that legalizing incest would increase inbreeding to such a degree that significantly harms society. Most people have extremely visceral negative reactions to incest, probably for biological and evolutionary reasons. There's also evidence for something called the Westermark effect, which says that if you grow up with someone as a child, you fail to develop a sexual attraction to them. So not many people would do incest. Not many of those people who do incest would reproduce. And especially not many of these people would reproduce if inbreeding was also made illegal. And even if this did happen, many of the people who accidentally have incest babies or whatever would likely just have abortions or something like that. So the amount of strain on society that would occur if we legalized incest would likely be extremely negligible, right? There are way bigger problems that we could deal with, right? And it would be even more negligible if we criminalized inbreeding, which I'm not even convinced that we should do. So, and then finally, I guess, like, in a world where incest is legal, people who had an inbred baby would be more likely and more able to explicitly seek out and be provided by the government things like prenatal screening and gene therapy for the fetuses, which are things that we currently provide to people with disorders who have children who say, look, I have a disorder and I had a child, can I receive access to this thing? And so, yeah, I would just say that, like, we have a variety of reasons to think that, I just don't think that genetic, so I would just, in summary, like, the genetic appeal to incest at best works only as an argument for inbreeding rather than as an argument for incest. And even as an argument against inbreeding, it has some serious problems. So yeah, I guess that's all I'd say.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, and I do agree that inbreeding does not apply in all cases. So obviously, we had cases like I brought up earlier, cases of say like homosexual incest, right? Like we're not really worried about a pregnancy from that. Typically, unless we get into the explorations of gender that I do not intend to explore in this conversation. But yeah, we can say absolutely safely there that yeah, not every case has inbreeding, that it's not necessarily present. However, it is going to be present as a serious risk in many cases. I can tell you that my wife was using birth control, and I can tell you that my first son was very much a surprise. Um, right. So a lot of the time, right, the stuff doesn't quite work how we plan. So even like if we were to criminalize, say specifically inbreeding, that doesn't mean that we wouldn't get these children, and that also wouldn't mean at all that. These people would be ready to have an abortion or anything like that, or that we even should or shouldn't encourage that. And we're not here to answer that abortion question today, I hope. So it does create a bit of a problem here, and I think on that non-identity problem, I think the thing that I would want to add there is from Slavascu and Kane on procreative beneficence, and one of the arguments from that, right, is that, hey, look, if you were a mother and you were about to have a kid while you were suffering from measles or any other disease that could harm the pregnancy, and you could have chosen, right? Would you have? Right. And so it seems kind of similar. And it reminded me, when you brought up that problem, it reminded me very much of that. And the answer seems to be, yeah, of course. Like if I could avoid this problem, I would have done it, right? The issue is at hand at this point in time, I can't, right? And so one of the ways that we do help, one of the things that the law does do is it does serve some paternal functions, right? Where it can kind of be used to nudge or direct people towards certain behaviors that wind up being in their own benefit. And sometimes that actually net increases autonomy, right? Which is a good thing, and we do want that in some instances. And I do agree that we should absolutely be concerned with some authoritarian intervention. Is it this? And I think on the inbreeding issue, or specifically on the incest issue, rather, I think you and I just disagree. But I will say this: as far as the harms to society, we do need to refer back to that utilitarian analysis we're kind of sympathetic to as we do this discussion, and we need to not just look at the two participants, but then we also need to look at the life of this child. We're going to be looking at everything there, right? If we're going to do a utilitarian analysis, we gotta do the utilitarian analysis. However we want to maximize utility or mitigate. Negative utility, or sorry, mitigate pain, right, or suffering for the largest number of people. However we want to approach that, I'm willing to play ball here for the sake of debate, but we got to think about that for all people involved in this. And it's not just the two in the relationship, right? We have an entire society. So when we're talking about using these liberal arguments to say, well, see, they're not burdening anyone else. Well, in a state where your tax dollars are going to fund other people's health care, and this is something that's preventable by not engaging in a particular risky behavior, and that behavior is a taboo, and that behavior is illegal already. It seems like you have some pretty strong reason to not engage in that, and that the community could say, yeah, I really don't want to support all of this extra money, all this extra funding going into these expensive gene therapies and going into all of this, just to say, yeah, your incest is totally, permissible now. The community may say, no, we really don't want the money we're spending on welfare to go to those things, because we want welfare for other situations, and that's okay for the community to do. It's their government; they get to choose. So I think I'll leave it there. If you had any responses for that.
Yeah, so, okay, I would just say, like, a few things. So, firstly, you appeal to the point that some people would still have incest babies, like, on accident, even if inbreeding was legal, or even if inbreeding was illegal. And I guess that's kind of plausible, but I would just say that, like, look, the number of people who would be impeded by a law against incest, they would say, oh, I really want to have sex with this family member, but I'm not going to because there's a law against incest. The amount of people who would be impeded by that, but who wouldn't be impeded by a law against, like, inbreeding, such that they wouldn't avoid taking risks that could cause inbreeding. I think that number would be very small. I can't imagine this being a very significant amount of people, right? So I mean, like, I guess I just think about it like it's just like the amount of people who would do incest if it were legal would be very low. The amount of people who would do incest and reproduce would be even lower. The amount of people who would do so even if inbreeding were illegal would be even lower. And then many of those people would still get abortions or something. And so it's just very unlikely that inbreeding would increase to such a degree that justifies putting people in prison for incest, even if we assume that inbreeding is a bad thing. And then also, I mean, the argument you're making about inbreeding, it's just the force of that argument is going to depend very strongly on how committed a person is to reducing genetic disorders. And one way to gauge how strongly committed they are to doing this is to ask whether you're also in favor of outlawing relationships between people with serious genetic disorders, right? And I think most of us would not be okay with biting that bullet. And I would also say that with respect to the question about like the non-identity problem and whether or not there's a harm to the child, I would just say, like, sure, I could concede that it would be preferable, because you brought up the measles example. Wouldn't it be preferable for this woman to have a child when she didn't have measles? And sure, I could concede that it would be preferable if a healthier baby was born compared to a less healthy baby. But if nobody is actually harmed, or the only harm is the loss of a potential being from coming into existence and their potential happiness, I don't think that suffices as justification for locking people up, right? I don't think it even comes close, right? We wouldn't lock someone up for not having sex every time they're fertile because they're giving up the opportunity to bring new happy people into the world. We wouldn't lock someone up for having a baby when they're poor, when it could have had a better life if the parents had waited a few years and had it when they were in a better financial position. We wouldn't, even to go to your example, I think most people would find it crazy to lock someone up because they had a baby while they were on measles rather than having a baby while they weren't on measles. And so, and like additionally, right, like even if somebody accepts abortion as being completely fine, we wouldn't say that a woman is like morally obligated or should be legally obligated to like abort a disabled fetus so that she can have a different non-disabled baby, etc. And so, like, yeah, I mean, I agree with your appeal that it would be preferable if she had a healthier baby, but I just don't think that this is sufficient when we really think about it for, you know, making this activity illegal. And I would say that you brought up the harm to society more broadly. And I agree that we can't just take into consideration the harm done to the two people. We have to consider the harm done to the child. But if I've argued, I think I've argued that there is no harm to the child, right? The child is as well off as he could have been. And if she would have had a child that wasn't inbred, it would have just been a different child. And so the child wasn't harmed. And then with respect to the harm to society more broadly, I agree that should be taken into consideration. I just don't think that the harm to society broadly would be very considerable based on the considerations that I have presented a couple times, just with respect to, like, look, it's not likely that a law legalizing incest, especially if inbreeding is still illegal, would lead to any like considerable or like non-negligible increase in rates of inbreeding and genetic disorders and so on. Yeah, so I guess that's what I would say.
Yeah, and I think let's really focus on that non-identity problem here just for a minute. I think that the issue here is if non-existence would be preferable to because we're talking about a different child being born, and we can agree to that, right? I could agree to that on my end and say, well, yeah, it would be better in many of these cases uh, where someone's born with, schizophrenia, cleft palate, diabetes, malformed limbs, their nervous system is firing, they're just constantly in pain. We could conceivably agree, for the sake of a utilitarian analysis, like, hey, it would be better for that person to have not been born than and some other person being born that didn't have those problems. It seems like that would just be better, right? And that seems to be, if we're going to be leveraging utilitarianism, that seems to be part of the issue at hand. But I did want to touch on some other things, which is, we have other things to factor into this analysis as well, and this is one of the problems with utilitarian analysis. It's not that it's a bad tool for assessing the consequences; it's a fantastic tool. But the issue at hand is there are so many variables to plug and play. So for instance, we aren't just looking at, say, the cost of the taxpayer, which is going to be there. We're not just looking at the health of the child or the health of the family, which are both all of those are very important. We're not just looking at the sexual pleasure or the pleasure that an incestuous relationship gives its two participants, right? We're also looking at what does that do to the family unit. So like and this is kind of the comical example, right? But I just kind of imagine like walking into the Thanksgiving dinner and and then hearing that, like, I don't know, like my sister, like, and my dad did something, and I would be so just out of sorts, right? The negative the negative, our negative heat-ons here are going to be, through the roof for me. The pain, the pain and the emotional anguish for me would be through the roof, to a level where I could, rationally say, like, yeah, I don't know how good this relationship is for you, but it's so bad for me. And then now now the family unit itself has had this radical shift in reliability for me, knowing how things work in this, right? And that's going to be a source of severe psychological trauma, not just for me, but also other members of my family. And with the legalization of this, we're kind of encouraging these things in a sense. We should actually, let me correct that. We're no longer discouraging that from really coming out into the open, right? And that seems to be kind of your point here is, hey, we want this stuff out in the open so that we can discuss it, we can have these conversations, we can remove the stigma. But now when we do that, right, we're going to be harming other family members too. And then those other family members are going to go off into the world with that, and it is going to in fact affect other people as well. So like, if we're going to go this utilitarian route, like, my response would be like, hey, let's really think about this all the way. And my last point on that utilitarian note is, we don't just look at this first round of this first generation of incest, where incest is maybe still taboo but now legal, and there's a couple people doing it. We'd also look at the next generation, so on and so forth, as these types of trends gain some amount of traction, which is now that door is open. And so it seems plausible to me that we would see an increase in incestuous behavior following its legalization. We would see an increase in a lot of the negative utility, all of these other family units impacted, and these shifts in the family dynamics that we rely on and that we value. And the corresponding increases with costs and things like gene therapy or things like abortion services, all of this stuff. So the harm, the feasible harms that we're dealing with for the sake of utilitarian analysis are not limited at all to the gene node or to the genetics node. But that's pretty much all I have to say on that point.
Okay, so I would say like a few things. So it seemed like you agreed that sure, like there is no like actual existing kid who's harmed. I'm just saying that like from a utilitarian perspective, it would be better if there was a more healthy kid. And like again, like I agree with that. It would be better for like if a woman could either like have an inbred baby or a non-inbred baby. Just looking at the utility of the like that the non-inbred baby would experience throughout its life versus the inbred baby, I would say that it's better. It would be preferable for the non-inbred baby to be born. But my point is just that I don't think that like I think that if we're acknowledging that there's no real harm to anyone, it would have just have been better if she would have brought a different person into existence than the one that she brought into existence. I just don't think that that's enough to justify like locking people up over this, right? So like again, like if there's like a woman who is like with someone and she's like pretty poor, but she knows she's going to get a promotion in like 3 years, and then she's going to be in a much better position, and she knows that if she waited like a few years to have the baby would have better developmental outcomes and would have a better life because it would grow up in a more economically prosperous situation. But she nonetheless, just out of passion, saying, no, I want a baby now with you, because she was so in love or something, and then she had the baby. I don't think that we would think it's okay to lock her up for that. I don't think that I don't think we would even say that a moral obligation she had was broken. I would say that she didn't do something that most of us would consider like supererogatory, meaning it's not morally obligatory. It just would have been morally preferable if she'd have done otherwise. But it would just be completely overbearing and absurd to hold her to a moral obligation to bring the best potential person into existence and so on. You brought up a few other considerations in addition to the like the harms to society, like, you know, the healthcare costs and the genetic therapy costs and so on. And I think I've mostly addressed those kinds of considerations, so I don't want to go back over it again to like, and you know, like waste everyone's time by just me giving rebuttals again. So I think we probably just have reached a stalemate at that point. So I guess I'll just move on to some other things you said that I haven't addressed. You brought up the harms to like family members, like the harms to the family unit. I would say like a few things about this. Firstly, not all incestuous relationships threaten the family structure to a especially concerning degree. So, for example, like, you know, maybe if a father dates his daughter, the wife might be really mad. But if two siblings date, how does that really harm the family, right? The parents might be angry. But I mean, that's kind of just the parents' problem, right? Kids disappoint their parents all the time. Maybe if they're in a relationship and they break up, that causes tension. But with many families, there's loads of tensions between family members anyways, right? It's not like the family ends if siblings don't get along or have some tension or jealousy or something like that. Secondly, the integrity of the family, I would say, simply isn't a legal matter, right? Sure, if a family breaks up, that would be sad. But I mean, we're not going to send people to prison over a family breaking up. That's absurd, right? It's just a private affair. And thirdly, this argument, if taken to its logical conclusion, would lead us to conclusions that nobody would support, right? Should we outlaw homosexuality in like a homophobic society because a kid coming out as gay in a homophobic family would break up the family? Should we outlaw inheritance, which causes intense rivalry between family members who each want to inherit the stuff of a dead family member? Should we outlaw divorce, which clearly breaks up families? Of course not, right? Nobody would accept this. And fourth, I would say that this argument just undermines itself, because sure, incest might break up families, but another thing that breaks up families is imprisoning people over who they have sex with, and that's exactly what a criminalization of incest does. And I would additionally say, because there was also a sort of appeal to family roles, like we all have specific roles in a family, and we don't want that being messed with. And I would just say, sure, family members have certain roles and duties to each other, but the only roles that we generally think the law can enforce are things like don't neglect your children, don't abuse your family members, etc. But beyond this, the roles and duties different family members have should be decided by the families, right? We don't throw people in jail for having alternative lifestyles or for having unconventional roles. Secondly, an incestuous relationship need not be especially alternative. There's already a great deal of variety with respect to how family members relate to each other across different families. In some families, siblings are best friends. In some families, siblings hate each other, etc. So why should sexual attraction suddenly violate these roles in an especially egregious way? And also, finally, I would just say that this would apply to many common and accepted things, like I already said with the last point, which is just like this would favor, the same consideration would favor outlawing like divorce or inheritance, etc. And finally, you brought up that we can't just look at the first round. We'd have to look at the ongoing impact over time of legalizing incest, right? You said that like legalizing incest could cause big problems over the course of many, following generations. And I would just say that that's certainly possible. But again, if we're going to say that we should make something illegal, it's not enough to say, well, there could be these potential side effects over a long period of time. You'd have to give a compelling reason for why we should actually expect that to happen. And I wouldn't expect that to happen to a considerable degree, because like I said, like most of us, like I feel a little uncomfortable when I just talk about incest, right? It's gross, right?
Mhm.
Most of us think incest is gross, and I don't think that's just a cultural thing. I think it's a biological thing. There's a lot of evidence for that. That it's like it makes evolutionary sense why we would have a natural aversion to incest, and it would also like there, like I said earlier, there's this psychological effect called the Westermark effect, which basically says that it's when you grow up with someone as a child, you're generally speaking almost certainly going to fail to develop a sexual attraction for them. Um, and so, like, I think we have good reason to think that even if we legalized and even if we destigmatized incest, not enough people would start doing it, even over the course of many generations, for this to cause some substantial problem or some substantial drain on our resources or increase in genetic disorders among the general population. I just don't think it would. We have reason to think it would be that big of a problem.
Yeah, so there's a lot there to unpack, and I just wanted to say I what I'm wary of the most is and what I would like to really make sure we both avoid for this debate is trivializing the marriage equality movement, um, and all of the progress and work that LGBT relationships have had to go through in order to kind of earn their place in a family unit in America, right? And I think that we can point to some different things here. Now, I know there's one fact you and I agree on, which is, or disagree on rather, which is that incest is categorically abusive. But I think it's fairly clear that gay marriage is not, right? And so even with that shift in the family dynamic, there's a difference here. And this is a move that's seen a lot online with a lot of people that are supporting incest, is to try to co-opt the language of the marriage equality movement to go after this. But we have to look at the legal reality, right? The legal reality was made quite evident in California with Prop 8. And the reality is that gay marriage is clearly constitutionally protected, and there's no grounds for that restriction. Um, Whereas incest is not, right? Which means that, hey, these pre-existing bans, right, as far as motivating the scrutiny required to either get them overturned in the courts or to legislate against them, right? That burden has to fall on the person advocating for incest legalization. That's simply how the legal system works. The legal system's not going to sit there and justify the law as it is. Rather, we have to see that there is a demonstrable harm with damages attached, right? That needs to be taken into the legal system, or you need to then go and get the rest of the people to go ahead and vote on that, or vote legislators into positions of power where they can then go ahead and craft laws around incest to legalize it and overturn those previous restrictions. Um, but I also wanted to turn to why the family unit is important here, and why certain changes are acceptable and certain changes aren't. And the very simple solution is that we have shared values as a society. We have shared values in our subcultures, including our families. And yeah, you're right to point out that those values do differ between family units, although they are kind of generally homogenous, right? Um, and that's what we see. A child's in a position where they look up to their parents 99% of the time for support, for care, for the things that they need, and those are good things that we should be encouraging. We want parents to support their children. We want children to look to their parents for that support whenever possible. And part of the reason we have family courts, as you kind of alluded to, right, is to ensure that support's happening and ensure that those things are being met. Now, you talked about imprisonment and how that breaks up the family unit, and we can absolutely discuss at great length how the prison system harms people of all kinds. And I think this is our first real conversation. One of my education goals is kind of, looking at, hey, could I become that public defender so I could help people avoid prison? And because it does terrible things to them. And I think you and I can agree there. However, there is a distinction between should we fix the criminal justice system and should we legalize a behavior. In other words, just because the criminal justice system is terrifying in the United States does not at all imply that we should just pull the laws back up off the table and allow free reign, for whatever to occur. So the criminal justice system, in my mind, is not really relevant to the argument at hand. We need to be talking about better ways to deal with these things. So that's something. Now, you also wanted to bring up why sex among family members is, is some kind of exception to this, right? Why is this the exceptional thing here? Well, sex is kind of, a bit of a very sacred, or for those that don't like that word, it's a very personal thing. You are giving something to someone. You are changing your dynamic. And if you were to have sex with a sibling, there's a high probability that, depending on where things go, that may create some irreconcilable differences down the line in your relationship. It's one thing to have a sibling. It's another thing to have to break up with them later. And that's the type of thing that we need to be looking at here. This isn't just awkward Thanksgiving dinners we're talking about, right? These are longstanding relationships. We want people to be able to lean on for as long as they're alive, because we see that those are good, right? We see that the family provides these types of support, and it's good. And when we throw sex into the ring in many of these relationships where it's not appropriate, we do see that those relationships can be compromised. And finally, I wanted to turn to that Westermark effect. When you grow up with someone being less likely to develop a sexual attraction, I think is true. I'm not going to go Freudian here or anything like that. What I did want to say, though, is, and I don't want to just rehash old points, but when we talk about the emotional incest, we talk about the grooming, we talk about those things, and we talk about those going under the radar, right? Those are the types of things that I think would probably be likely to maybe override that observed effect, and that is worthy of note. So, children can be groomed to do all kinds of things, which is definitely concerning for those of us that are against child abuse. And a lot of those behaviors can carry over into adulthood as well, and continue to impact their lives in severe negative ways. So, I hope that wasn't too much word vomit.
Yeah,
I'll let you go. Yeah.
Yeah. So I would just say, like, there's quite a bit there that I think, there's quite a bit there that I think I've previously spoken to. So, like you said, like, because I brought up the comparison to homosexuality because you said, we should make incest illegal because if an incest happens, it might make like the parents upset or something like that, and therefore, it should be illegal because we don't want to break up families. And I just said, well, look, a child coming out as gay in a homophobic society will also likely break up the family or cause tensions in the family. And I don't think anyone would say that therefore, like, coming out as homosexual should be illegal, right? Because I just don't think that, like, this is a legal matter, right? Like, similarly, like, we wouldn't say that, like, inheritance should be illegal, even though inheritance can cause all kinds of conflicts between families. We don't think divorce should be illegal, even though that obviously like necessarily breaks up families, etc. And then you sort of responded to my comparison with homosexuality by saying that, well, incest is inherently abusive and homosexuality isn't. But I think that's just sort of, at that point, you're just making a different argument, right? Because now the argument isn't that incest should be illegal because anything that breaks up families should be illegal. Now the argument is incest should be illegal because it's sort of inherently abusive. But I think I've also spoken to that, because I would just say, like, I don't think incest is inherently abusive. What's the super problematic power dynamic between siblings of a similar age? And even if we're talking about siblings with large age gaps or parents, the relationship you have with your family members when you're adult is not the same as the relationship you had with them when you were a child, and there were these problematic power dynamics. And then if the relationship did start when they were a child, then that's just a different issue. And that's something I would oppose, right? And so, yeah, I made all sorts of arguments about the appeal to abuse. That was just one of them earlier, so I guess I don't want to rehash too much of that. You also said that, like, look, as a matter of fact, incest is just not legal and homosexuality is. Look, I would just say that, like, if the conversation we're having is should we as a society elect a government that will make incest legal, whether or not incest currently, based on the government we have, is illegal, is not really going to bear on that normative question. You also said that children look up to their parents most of the time, and that this is like a very consistent thing we find in families, and we have family courts to ensure this kind of thing. But I don't think we do, right? I mean, there are children with very different relationship to their parents. So I've known people who don't really look up to their parents as, like, in this authority-like way that most people do, but rather they're more like friends with their parents, right? Like their parents, have that more sort of peer relationship with them. And we absolutely don't outlaw that or have family courts step in to say, hey, no, this is the specified role you have to have with your child, and if you deviate from that, you're going to be locked up. Because generally we just think that this isn't a legal matter, right? Like whether or not people want to have different roles or alternative ways of having relationships within their families, it's just not going to be something that's condemned by the state. And you said that the prison system harms people of all kinds. It's very harmful, but just because the legal system is harmful doesn't mean that we need to legalize something. And I would agree, it doesn't necessarily mean that, but I think it weighs into the calculation, right? Like, if we have a prison system, and when we put people into that prison system, it causes them a significant degree of harm, then the harm that causes is going to weigh into the moral calculus when we're talking about whether or not we should create a situation wherein we're throwing people in that system for a particular reason, right? It's not, again, it's not, I didn't say it's a decisive consideration, like, oh, we should legalize murder just because it harms murderers to put them in prison. Obviously not. I'm just saying that, like, the harm caused by the prison system counts in favor of us not throwing people in there, and so we would just need, like, an extra strong overriding reason to justify it. You also talked about how, sex is a very personal thing. And if you have sex with a sibling, that makes things weird. If a breakup ends up occurring, I think I also spoke to that a little bit earlier when I addressed the broader appeal to family dynamics, so I don't want to go over that again. And then you also talked about the Westermark effect, but you think that grooming can override that effect. So, if a child is groomed by their parent, they might end up having sex with them. And that's bad, and I agree that that's bad. But again, I'm just going to say that I addressed this earlier when I talked about the abuse thing, which is just to say, like, first, we already have laws against grooming, and also we have reason to believe that laws against incest can make laws against grooming less effective. And so, yeah, I guess that's what I would say.
Yeah, I'm going to move on after this. Whenever you're ready, I just have a couple quick responses here. I'm wary of missing the mark on my point there on gay marriage and the legalization of gay marriage. I'm pointing to constitutionality, right? And I'm pointing to, hey, look, we have this document, which I think we would generally argue as either a legal or ethical document. I think it's kind of like a meta-legal document, if you will. That's kind of my preferred approach to the Constitution. And you may agree or disagree with that, but it's kind of a code of conduct or kind of a standard for us to look back at and assess our laws with, right? And so the point there was that, hey, look, incest, anti-incest laws align with constitutional scrutiny. They have the overwhelming amount of legal analysis is there. I can provide you some links for that if you'd like. But they have survived that level of scrutiny, and so it's not that just because it's legal, that means it's right to be legal, or just because something's illegal, that it's right to be illegal, right? I think you and I can agree that that's not a sufficient basis, and that's not my argument. I'm also wary of the phrasing around the family court thing, and I just wanted to offer for clarity, right? My point is that it's about ensuring a certain dynamic is occurring in that family, right? Now, yes, we do have to leave that door open for some autonomy, and I think you and I agree there, right? But in instances like someone not paying child support or neglecting a child or abusing a child, I think you and I both agree that yes, these are good things for family courts to be looking at and to be prescribing certain courses of action, corrective action for those. Um, but my big hesitation here, and I think kind of maybe the springboard into our next topic, might be that I'm wary of the fact that there's not really a clear way to demonstrate these damages, such that let's say that you committed an act of incest and got popped for it and went to court, and then you tried to argue it on constitutional grounds, or you tried to argue that the law somehow was harming you. Um, I don't see that. I don't see that because I think the state has compelling interests, both in preventing the public backlash and outcry, both in protecting the welfare of the participants involved. I think that the state would say, "Hey, look, under the scrutiny, the various levels of constitutional scrutiny we would apply towards these laws, and we'd look at it. We're looking at laws that we have in power that are popular, that are consistent with the values of our people, and you're coming in here saying that harmed you, but you knew the rule, right? You knew the rule, and it to them it will ring like, hey, look, the murderer complaining, kind of like that example you brought up, the murderer complaining of the murder restrictions, the homicide restrictions harming them. They're just going to say, hey, look, I don't see it. So if you can't bring it to court to legalize it, right, then how do you have the grounds, to contest it otherwise, right? And so you have to. It seems like you have to push for a different shift, and this kind of gets back to one of my arguments, right, which is you would need to get the people to agree that incest is morally permissible, or morally a non-issue, prior to saying that it would or should be legalized, that we should take a legal action, right? We would need to have that agreement among the people, such that we're ensuring that they're represented. Otherwise, you're going to need to demonstrate this autonomy principle somehow, from this autonomy principle, that hey, this is such a harm to autonomy that if we don't allow it, we're just perpetuating this grave injustice. And I don't think I don't see that, and that's what I'm struggling to see. So if you could help maybe shed some light on that part of your argument, this autonomy part, and how I get from autonomy and liberty and those principles to I should be able to engage in incest if I want to. It's not really the government's business. The government should back out of it. That would be fantastic for me.
Okay, so I mean, I would just say, like, firstly, with respect to the idea that incest criminalization isn't unconstitutional, I don't know if my argument requires that incest criminalization be unconstitutional. At most, my argument would require that legalization of incest is not unconstitutional. But insofar as both are constitutional, I think I can still say, like, hey, I think this law is preferable to this other law based on these normative principles that I can articulate, and that I think most people would come to agree on reflection, especially if they share this sort of liberal view of consent and legality that I articulated, and that I think most of our laws surrounding sex are most consistent with. And so you also said, like, if you can't appeal to the courts, how would you make it incest legal? Well, I mean, presumably we could just, like, pass a law, through Congress or through whoever. I mean, there already are places in the U.S. Well, actually, I don't know if places, but definitely in Ohio, incest is legal, right? So, I mean, we can just pass laws that make this the case without necessarily appealing to unconstitutionality in the court structure or anything like that. And you also said that we need to, unless I can prove that we're perpetuating like this especially strong injustice by allowing incest to be illegal, then we have no basis on which I can say that it should be decriminalized or legalized. And I would just say, like, I think it's the other way around, right? I think that in general, if someone wants to make something illegal, the burden of proof is on them to provide strong reason why it should be illegal. Because otherwise, right? Like, if I asked you, like, why should it be illegal, or why should it be legal to, I don't know, collect snow outside of my house, or like build a snowman, you would just like look at me funny and you'd say, wait, what do you mean? Like, why should it be illegal? Right? We don't start from a place where everything is illegal and then make things legal as we can, only when we can provide especially strong arguments for making them legal. So I think that's just the you're putting the cart before the horse, so to speak, there. And also, I think I have presented semi-compelling arguments that there is an injustice being perpetuated, which is just to say that we're causing people suffering by throwing them in prison. We're violating people's autonomy. We're violating the principle that we should generally consider consent to be a necessary and sufficient condition for a sexual encounter being legal, which I think is generally a plausible principle. I've given utilitarian arguments. And you said you wanted me to clarify a bit on the autonomy part. And I guess I can do that. I would just say, like, because you wanted to know how I get from autonomy to we should legalize incest. And I mean, it's very straightforward. It's not that I think that autonomy, that violating autonomy is categorically bad. I just think that in general, violating the fact that an act violates someone's autonomy counts against doing that act, right? And clearly, legalizing or making incest illegal violates people's autonomy, because we're saying we're legally not going to allow you to do what you want to do with your own body, right? And there could be strong overriding reason that overrides that and says, okay, well, there's sufficient harm by legalizing incestual relationships such that it justifies infringing on people's bodily autonomy. But I would just say I don't think I've heard an argument to that effect that would constitute like giving me an overriding reason. But I guess that's going to be our core disagreement, because that's what we've been discussing for most of the conversation.
Yeah. Could you restate that last sentence for me one more time? I just want to make sure I captured what argument you need.
I would just need an argument that there is some harm associated with legalizing incest that overrides autonomy considerations plus all the other considerations that I've presented.
Okay.
And I haven't been convinced of that.
Gotcha. Yeah. So, and I think this is one of our core disagreements, kind of getting back to the burden of proof there. And so I want to start there and then work backwards on some of the points that you offered. And then after this, if you want to respond to me and then move into closing, I'd be happy to, because I think
Sure.
we're a little bit over time. And I know there's so many arguments here that have or have not been addressed just for lack of time. And we could probably talk about this for like 4 hours. Yeah. So as far as the harm associated with incest as a basis of criminalization of incest, right? I think this is where there's the largest disconnect between you and I in this debate of all of the things that we've discussed so far. So we can agree that there's going to be a complicated and nuanced utilitarian analysis that we may or may not want to engage in, particularly if we want to engage on this basis. I'm not personally a utilitarian, but I'm playing ball for the sake of debate, right? And I'm happy to say, hey, look, yeah, we should understand and deliberate on the consequences anyway of our actions. Like, that seems reasonable. Even to me here in virtue ethics land, that seems like a reasonable thing to do. So let's look at them. But the problem here is that we're not discussing if we should criminalize incest. We're discussing if we should legalize it, right? Incest is already overwhelmingly criminalized. It's already illegal. So that's an issue. And I think that's a pretty big issue for the argument here, particularly for the burden of proof, because we're trying to motivate a new action of legalization, this next action, right? And so you and I can both agree on this aspect of critique, right? That, hey, our solutions, if we're going to be positing a solution, we do need to have certain things met. Right. And so the spirit of that kind of critique, I think, is true of both of our arguments, where we want to make sure all of these concerns are met. I think the difference is, right, you're the one advocating for the change in the status quo. Right. And that change, because it is a change, right, that's going to motivate kind of a need for the burden of proof to be addressed by you. Bringing forth that proposition. So that might be the biggest issue here. But with that being said, as far as the harms associated with incest, right, and I think this is some of our disagreement, and I don't want to totally rehash everything, but yeah, there's the risks with inbreeding, there's the propensity for like grooming, psychological abuse, there are these sociological harms, what happens to the family structure, what happens to other people when they do this. What happens when your neighbor that is so ooked out, or is we might characterize them in the world of legalized incest, right, as the anti-incest bigot, right? What happens when they get wind of that, right? And now we have these people practicing incest that's allegedly consensual, and they come under the gun from that person. That's another type of harm that we need to consider, and that we need to have strong plans for and dealing with, so that we're not seeing this massive public backlash from a taboo. Sometimes it's just not the right time. Now, as far as passing a law through Congress to this effect, I think you also run into a practical problem, which is, the number of people, and you've talked about this, but the number of people inclined to agree with incestuous behavior, or not agree rather, but because we know that number is low as kind of the default with the taboo, but the people willing to participate in incestuous behavior, we do know that number is fairly low. You brought up the Westermark effect, and sure, maybe if some people are groomed, that does increase the probability of them having sex within the family, things like that, and it seems like we're generally of an agreement there. But on that note, right, you're going to be asking your congressperson to do something that is so taboo for you, right, and then to get all of the other Congress people, all the other senators, right, or enough of them on board with this. And think about all of the other important things that you need them to be doing. We're talking about fixing welfare in this country so that people who need help are getting help. We're talking about fixing our economy so that there's jobs and things that people can do, making sure people have health care and quality education, and all of these things that we've identified as goods because these are our community's values, because this is what we want, right? And when you go and tie this incest thing to them, right, now they have a massive obstacle in preventing those things, right? And so while this may be tangential to or further down the line on our utilitarian analysis as some maybe like tertiary effects down the line, let's not abandon that, right? We'd be telling our Congress people to actually adopt some pretty I think what America would largely consider cringy positions that may cost them future elections and lose them to parties that would do terrible things in the United States. And we should absolutely be wary of that. Now, as far as do people agree that incest is permissible upon reflection? Maybe upon reflection of like the extended kind of thoughts from liberal values, and maybe people do share a lot of those liberal values. But I think people also put some reasonable stopping places there, right? So I think one of those stopping places we could demonstrate an example with perhaps like the Second Amendment. I think most people are for background checks of some form. And we could look at the text of the Second Amendment and say, hey, it says the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, right? And if limiting a criminal from getting a firearm is an infringement, which, we want to go to like Webster's dictionary of, the 1800s and go discuss that. And we go, hey, you know what? That does look like an infringement according to that. Right. But they'll say, yeah, you know what? Maybe some of these liberal values aren't everything they're cracked up to be. I have a little bit more common sense than that. We can see from the empirical data that we are preventing criminals from getting firearms by having these background checks, and that's doing good for society. Right. Sometimes the reflection on liberal values, frankly, isn't enough. Right. And further, we're not too concerned with the proposition incest is permissible. We're concerned with incest should be legalized, and the simple fact of the matter is that the people disagree, right? And so when we get into the shared values of the community and ensuring those are represented in the democracy, we don't have a constitutional issue here. We do have the people voting their will into power. If the people wanted to vote in politicians to change this incest thing, they could have already done it, right? And so like when I put all that together, it just seems like it's not really the time to be talking about legalizing incest.
Okay, so I would just say, firstly, with respect to the question of the burden of proof, you said that the burden of proof is on me because we currently have laws against incest. But I don't think I accept that characterization of the burden of proof when we're talking about should we make something legal, should we make something illegal, right? Because I don't think that it makes sense to say that the normative legitimacy of a law is in some respect relative to the laws that currently exist in a given society, right? So imagine we had like this dystopian society where almost every activity is illegal, right? Like sex is illegal, going on a jog is illegal. Like literally almost everything a person can do is illegal. And then imagine like I come into that society and I'm like, hey, I think that like as a moral matter, these things should not be illegal. Would you say like, okay, well, given that every single thing is outlawed in this society, the burden of proof is on you to provide strong, some strong reason to legalize every single thing that you want to be legal. Well, in all likelihood, I wouldn't be able to do that. So that's just basically amounting to say, yeah, it should be the case that in this hypothetical society, everything should stay illegal. Because if everything is already illegal, not very likely that I'm going to be able to provide like some clear cut argument for legalizing every single thing that's already illegal. And so I think that what reflecting on sort of hypotheticals like that shows is that no, regardless of what the current laws are, the normative burden of proof is still on the person who wants to outlaw something to show why that thing should be outlawed. Because any other principle just sort of seems to lead to unacceptable results. You also talked about, well, what happens when bigots get wind of incest? That could cause some harm to the people who are engaging in incest. But I don't think that, I think that is going to apply to, I think that position is going to have some like really harsh reductios, right? So should we make, like in a racist society, should we make intermarrying, interracial marriage illegal because we're afraid of what will happen to people who do it if bigots catch wind of it? Obviously not, right? Should we make homosexuality illegal because we're afraid of what's going to happen to homosexuals if bigots find out? Obviously not, right? And just, I think that's obvious enough, but if you want additional reasons for why that would be the case, the first reason would be that, look, this stigma exists and it's going to cause people harm, but the fact that the stigma is causing people harm, right, and the fact that there are bigots out there is a bad thing, and we should be working to alleviate that stigma, and that stigma is going to only be alleviated when we start taking steps such as legalizing these activities that are stigmatized, right? And the second reason is just it's going to be less like utilitarian and more just like, look, if two free adults have decided, look, I know this activity is stigmatized, but this is how I want to express myself, and I'm willing to bear the burden of that stigma because I just want to be who I am and engage in this activity regardless. I mean, who are you to say, no, I need to protect you from the stigma, so I'm not going to allow you to express yourself? I mean, that just seems absurd. And in addition to that, you talked about like political capital, like if we have our politicians vote for incest, that might harm them. And that might be true, but I would just say that what we're doing when you say something like that is I think you're just conflating pragmatism with morality, right? Which is to say that So for another example, right? I think that the most moral way to structure our healthcare provision in the United States would be through a sort of a single payer like healthcare system. But I also think that given who's in Congress, it's very unlikely that we'd ever be able to achieve that. And so I think we should, in the meantime, push for something more politically feasible, like a public option or some sort of a multi-payer system. But I can hold those positions simultaneously. I can say this law would be most moral to have, like this would be the most moral law, uh, while at the same time saying and furthermore, I could say that this is the most moral law, and we should have this law. We should have single payer, while at the same time saying that, like, based on current political circumstances, it's maybe not wise to put all of our political capital into fighting for that thing at the current moment, right? And then, in addition, you brought up the issue of stopping points, and you brought up this analogy to gun rights. Like, sure, some people think that we should be very liberal on gun rights, but they're still going to admit, like, okay, well, maybe these liberal considerations aren't all they're cracked up to be all the time. There could be overriding reason in this particular case to accept something like background checks, even though I generally support gun rights. I just think there should be the stopping point. But I would just say that these two things are disanalogous. The case that you presented, the reason we would put that stopping point is because even though we generally take like the liberal position on people should just be able to own guns because of autonomy to be a consideration, in some cases, like in the cases of background checks, there are alternative, overriding, normatively legitimate considerations that make it such that we should just override the liberal considerations. And so I'm just going to say that these things are disanalogous because I don't believe that there is a normatively legitimate overriding reason to set the stopping point at incest, right? And I guess that's sort of what we've been arguing. And finally, I will just say that with respect to the idea that like people disagree that incest should be legalized, I mean, I just don't think that we would ever accept this as like a normative legitimating factor that we shouldn't have this law because people disagree with the law, right? Surely, if we lived in a society where slavery was legal and 90% of people were white slave owners who were in favor of slavery being legal, that wouldn't mean that it's morally legitimate to continue having that law, or that it wouldn't be morally preferable to overturn that law. So yeah, I guess that's all I really had to say.
Yeah, and then I guess I'll respond, and then if you want to respond to me, and then move into your closing, and then if you're good with that.
Sure. Yeah.
But yeah, so I just wanted to talk about a few of those points because I know some of them have been. I just like when we go in circles and there's some obvious disagreements on facts between us, where we would just be kind of going in a circle back and forth for a long time here. But I wanted to first talk about this world of everything illegal and demonstrating and meeting the burden of proof to demonstrate that there's an issue with that. And this is kind of like a bit of an outlandish kind of like silly world, right? But like it's a quality intuition pump, I think, and we could look at that world and say, well, of course, not everything can be illegal, right? It would be illegal to enforce the law. So the system defeats itself. It's a non-starter. It's very easy for me to demonstrate that burden of proof. But maybe in this world, right, we're not talking about everything literally being illegal, but we're saying, hey, walking down the street at any point during the day is illegal. And it's like, well, then if you continue with that law, we have good empirical reason to think that the masses will starve. They're going to get very pissed off. And then you're going to lose that government that's supposed to kind of maintain order. So it doesn't seem like this is a suitable way of maintaining any kind of order. Right. So it's very easy to meet that burden in many matters, and some matters are much more difficult. And I think incest is one of them. But we have even like matters of things like speech or firearms rights or Fourth Amendment or Fifth Amendment violations in the U.S. where it's still difficult to meet those burdens sometimes. But my point here on the after effects, like what to do with the bigots and everything, is not just about the harms to the bigots or something like that. It's not just about the harms to those individuals. It's what is the plan here, right? What's the next move? So, like, is someone going to come out with an incestuous relationship, and we're going to go, like the Civil Rights Act type of stuff, where we're going to then, militarize and deploy the National Guard there to defend their homes? Like, what is the plan to avoid the public fallout? Like, what do we know, or what do we anticipate that the public fallout would be from the violation of this taboo? So that's another thing. That's a really important consideration for our plans when we change the status quo, because if we're not accounting for where things will go from there, we can run into all kinds of perils and issues, right? So another issue is that legalization is not the only way to remove or to stigmatization or to destigmatize the issue. So there are other things that we can do. There are things like information campaigns that we've done on different issues in the past. And those can be really effective, right? And so we can have certain information campaigns put out over time where we do see a benefit to letting people know, hey, look, if you're a victim of this type of thing, or if you're involved in this type of thing, you can have these, these negative effects on your life, and we want to get you the help that you need to get out of that. We're not interested in making you feel bad, right? We want to actually demonstrate that you have some power and control in your life, and that you're able to form the relationships you want to form and such, right? And generally just making mental health more accessible. There's tons of things that we can do to destigmatize that do not involve legalization of a particular behavior that does have some stigma around it. And then finally, I wanted to discuss why I think that example is analogous, because sometimes this happens, I think, where an analogy is taken from the listener, maybe in a different way than the person speaking it is. So I just wanted to offer a little bit more clarity. The only extent that I want that question to be analogous is to say, sure, there are times where we override our liberal values because of other values, and there are times in the law where we do that as well, and where we find that fitting under the law. And it does seem like you and I agree on that point more broadly, and I just wanted to clarify that as well. But with that being said, I'll give you the last word to respond, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, so I would just say, with respect to the intuition pump that I gave, I said that, so sure, like, I of course I didn't mean like everything would be illegal in the sense that like even enforcing the law is illegal. That'd be self-defeating. I more so just meant like almost every activity that's legal now that's just like completely nonchalant, like walking down the street, or playing in the snow, or having sex, or forming friendships with other people. All of these things are illegal in this society. And it seemed like, you said like, okay, well, even if we're imagining this form of society, we could give good reasons for all of these things being legal. But the only way in which I could see that being the case is if the argument just applies to something like autonomy. Like, if we're going to say the reason we have good reason to make all of these things legal is because making them illegal violates something like autonomy, and all else equal, we shouldn't violate people's autonomy. And it seems like in these cases we have no overriding reason to violate people's autonomy by preventing them from doing these things, and so therefore we shouldn't do it. And so that's the only way in which I can see you holding the position that we could make a good argument for legalizing every single thing that's illegal. But if that's the argument you're going to accept, then I think that just is tantamount to conceding my point that the burden of proof actually is on you. Because if you think it's acceptable to just say, all else equal, it's wrong to violate people's autonomy, having a law against something violates people's autonomy, and therefore, unless we have an overriding reason, we shouldn't do it, then that's just you acknowledging, okay, yeah, if I want incest to be illegal, I should have to provide the overriding reason for it being illegal, in which case the burden of proof really is on you. And I do start out with the advantage, as I said in my opening. You also made the point that you said, like, what's the plan here? How do we avoid the public fallout? How do we avoid people being attacked for engaging in incest? And I mean, look, worst case scenario, there is none. But that worst case scenario, right? I mean, like that was already the case when we legalized things like gay marriage, right? We just said, hey, there's the stigmatized activity, and now you're allowed to engage in it. And, you might be attacked for that. Homophobic people might attack you. And we're not going to send in the National Guard or something to, protect married gay couples' homes. And so you're just going to have to take that risk. And so I would just say, like, and that was like a perfectly acceptable thing to do in that case. So I would say, like, even in the worst case scenario where we have no plan, the fact that there is no plan still doesn't provide good reason for criminalizing this thing just because it's stigmatized and just because there will be fallout. And I think I gave additional reasons why that's the case. Like, it's ultimately up to the person if they think it's fit for them to risk that stigma because they want to express themselves. Who are we to tell them that they're not allowed to do that? And also, the harm you're appealing to is harm caused by stigma, and legalization is a step towards reducing that stigma and therefore reducing that genre of harm that we both agree is a harm that counts in favor of us avoiding situations which would cause that harm. And now you also said that we can destigmatize things without criminalization. But I guess I don't know why we would ever do that, right, with respect to incest. Like, if we acknowledge that incest is not something that warrants people being stigmatized over it, I don't know why we would think that it does warrant people being thrown in cages over it. That just seems sort of bizarre. And then finally, like, with respect to the gun example, I guess I'm just sort of still unclear on what the point of that was, because, it seems like we both agree that in the case of guns, liberal considerations might, to some degree, count in favor of us legalizing people owning as many guns as they want. But then we should also have some laws that restrict that, because there are overriding considerations, like considerations related to preventing shootings and things like that, and preventing gun-related deaths and suicides and so on. And so if that's the case, that the reason, because you gave that as an example of, look, sometimes we allow stopping points on certain principles that we generally think count in favor of certain actions. And if that's the point, right, then all I'm saying is, like, sure, but then in order for the gun example to be analogous to the incest example, you would actually have to provide an overriding reason that justifies putting the stopping condition on incest. You'd have to appeal to some sort of harm that legalizing incest would cause that counts as that sort of overriding consideration. And I guess, as I've argued throughout this debate, I think the reasons that have been presented for that, to play that role, so things like genetic concerns related to inbreeding and concerns relating to abuse and grooming, I don't think these things really hold up to, I don't think these concerns hold up to scrutiny.
All right. Yeah, did you want to move into a closing statement?
Sure. I guess I don't have, like, much of a closing statement. I would just reiterate, like, look, all else equal, we should avoid making things illegal. Putting people in prison causes harm. We shouldn't violate people's bodily autonomy. We shouldn't violate people's right to do what they want to do with their own body, with other consenting adults. We should allow people to engage in activities that they consent to, because generally speaking, they know better than you do whether or not they're going to benefit from a certain activity. And we generally value privacy. We don't want the government snooping around in our private lives if we can avoid it. And we should respect people's choices. We all have some deviant preferences, some deviant tastes, according to one group or another. So we should just try to be more accepting, respect people's unique and sometimes disturbing to us preferences, and not demonize or lock them up for it. And yeah, so I guess I just think, like, in order for me to be okay with criminalizing incest, putting consenting adults in jail for what they do with their own bodies, I would need like a very strong reason to think that there's some overriding reason to do that. But I don't know. I haven't been persuaded of that. I think that if anything, incest harms our ability to deal with incestuous abuse. Or at worst, that's the case, and at best, laws against incest are just redundant because we already have laws covering things like abuse and grooming. I think with respect to genetic disorders, this isn't really going to be a problem that harms society to any substantial degree, just because we can, even if we legalize incest, that doesn't mean we have to legalize inbreeding and legalizing and it's just unlikely that enough people would ever engage in incest just because we have a biological aversion to it for this to constitute a substantial problem. With respect to family arguments, again, it just seems like preserving certain family roles or family relationships and making sure that families don't break up is just not a matter that concerns the state. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess I haven't, I don't think the burden of proof has been met that would justify making incest illegal. So, yeah, I guess that's my closing statement.
All right, and I'll try to keep mine brief here. So there's a few things going on, and I do want to thank Mouthy Infidel for taking this up. You said in the beginning, I think of it as kind of an uphill battle. I know he disagrees regarding that burden of proof. But we want to discuss that just further, right? When we are entering a debate and we are arguing in the affirmative for propositions, we do need to meet that burden of proof, and we do take on that burden of proof by arguing in the affirmative. So with that said, part of dealing with that is making sure that we address the core arguments of each other's positions in this debate, but also that we make sure that we address when we bring changes in law or when we recommend changes in law, that we can properly motivate those changes. And I don't think that was necessarily demonstrated today. In fact, I don't think it was demonstrated. But the most important counterpoint from my argument, I believe, was missed, right? And perhaps due to lack of time. But we need to have that discussion as to why the values of the people should not be reflected in government. Mouthy's response, it seems, is, well, change your values, right? Make it so that incest doesn't disgust you. Make it so that incest is acceptable to you. Will you? Can you? Some of these things just speak to your core, and even if you could, would it reflect the values of other Americans, right? If you had to legalize it right now, would it make sense? Would it make Americans happy, right? Now, I wanted to turn to think back on some of those experts we discussed, or I discussed earlier. So I wanted to talk about Dr. Samantha Allen, who holds a PhD in women's studies and specializes in sexuality, that there's no such thing as consensual incest. Joanne Zucchetto, a psychotherapist specializing in incest recovery, there's no such thing as consensual incest. Michael Salomon, psychologist. Part of the therapy for incest victims is to stop victimization by changing their perspective of being somebody who is okay to be the slave of somebody else, quote unquote. Right. And even the psychology professor, Timothy Harshorn, PhD, wrote, with incest, everybody loses. Right. Incest isn't good. Our experts are telling us it's not good. We've seen some reasons for that today. We've talked about some of the genetic disorders. We've talked about the psychological abuse. We've talked about the grooming and emotional incest that many children undergo. And those are critical things. And part of the reason that it's so critical is that we have to think about the power dynamics that I discussed earlier. Now, when I got that thing on consent, I wasn't pulling that out of nowhere. I wasn't using this more Millian model that Mouthy was using. Instead, I was referencing directly the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. And in their mind, there is no consent when the power dynamics are in play and are controlling that answer. Now, I also want you to think about the utility of pushing for this legalization of incest through Congress, sacrificing your political needs to, say, unionize, to lower taxes, to get that single-payer healthcare or universal basic income. We have good practical and ethical reasons to not sacrifice these at the altar of incest. And think further. We have traumatized families where things were working one way before and no longer work that way because sex is now open among family members. And also, Think about what happens to the communities that have suffered under these ethics and structures that they have, now utterly disregarded in the chaos they experience, much to the tune of, say, what Edmund Burke, Roger Scruton, Alistair McIntyre, or even Nietzsche would point to. When we lose these values, there are significant problems that we see occur in society. And think about the agreement that autonomy and isolation is not a reason to act in a particular way. Simply having the freedom to do something does not mean that we should. And finally, just search your conscience. Would you engage in incest? Would you will that someone else be incestuous? Are there really no other options for destigmatizing incest so nobody else gets, or so victims can't get help? If you hold that these democratic policies ought reflect our values, if you hold that this utilitarian calculus needs a lot more attention before we bring this proposal of legalization to the table, and if you hold that incest is abuse, and you agree with the experts and you agree with the geneticists about the risks of inbreeding and such, then I would say to vote with me on this debate and against this proposition. I'll close again with just another thank you to Mouthy, to you, the audience, and to Arco for hosting us here.
Thanks to both of you for debating. It was really, really interesting. I appreciate both of you spending your time here today. We're going to post a poll in debate event chat. Please only vote on this poll if you were here for 75% or more of the debate. Also, Walt, I know you said you needed to go, so
I've gotten away with things. So if anyone has any questions or whatever, I can stick around for a little bit.
Exactly. Right? Yeah. And Mouthy, are you able to answer some questions from people in the audience?
Sure.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you both so much. So I'll post the voting poll. If you have any questions, please put them in debate event chat.